Now, when we're talking about problems with public transportation in the United States, there are a few that we want to kind of focus in on here. One is that oftentimes people who are too poor to own a car may still not be able to reach their places of employment by public transportation. A lot of times, low income people tend to live in inner city neighborhoods, but the job opportunities, especially those requiring minimum training and skill, a lot of times are out in the suburbs, and the two just don't connect. I mean, if you look at the MARTA rail system here, for example, you you don't really see the system going into the suburbs much at all. It goes into Chamblee and Doraville a bit, going towards the northeast, and Dunwoody, Sandy Springs, and that's about it. You see a real void if you look at the northwest side. I mean, there's bus transportation. MARTA bus goes to Cumberland Mall, which is right around where 285 and 75 meet there on the northwest side, but there's no rail line going there, and so that can really a lot of times inhibit people's ability to make a living. Also, despite modest recent successes, most public transportation systems are caught in a vicious circle because fares don't usually cover operating costs. 250 a ride might seem expensive in comparison to other systems, but with a system like MARTA, we don't really receive funding from the entire state of Georgia, like most public transportation systems do receive funding from the state. And so even that expensive ticket does not cover operating costs. So what happens? Well, as ridership declines, fares have to increase, which drives away more passengers. And so you see this vicious circle sometimes. And we don't really get U.S. government funding for public transportation either. So, again, their operation costs are a little bit tricky. You compare this. Well, first of all, in fairness, we're using MARTA as an example because it's a case study that you read on from Atlanta Magazine. We'll talk about that more in just a moment. But when you compare, the MARTA system to, say, a system in a city of similar size, like Boston, I'm not going to use the New York system as an example because it's not a fair comparison, right? New York's on a different level. But if you're talking about a city that moves about the same amount of people as or as Atlanta does every day, Boston's a good example of this. And what you see here is a much more extensive public transportation system. In fact, the purple lines there even go way out into the suburbs, even as far out as New Hampshire to the north and Rhode Island to the south, which is pretty cool. And it's not to say that Boston's system doesn't have its problems. It certainly does. Part of it is just like decaying rail cars, and not having the funding to get new ones, to kind of meet the needs of the 21st century. So this system has issues too, but it's one of your better ones in the United States, and it's one of your most widely used ones in the United States. Atlanta's, for a city its size, a lot of times just doesn't really meet the needs of the metropolitan area like it can or should. Now, of course, if we're talking about why Atlanta, the article that you were asked to read in Atlanta Magazine on where it all went wrong is pretty insightful. It's pretty insightful, and kind of taking us all the way back to the late 60s, early 1970s when MARTA first goes online, and what went wrong, right? The rollout, first of all, was very problematic, and you read on that. If you take a look at this map here, this was actually the original proposal in the 1960s for what MARTA was initially supposed to look like, and this is before it would even expand. I think I told you guys before, at least some classes, that the final stop on the MARTA rail line was supposed to go on the northwest side was supposed to go all the way to Marietta Square, and you actually see evidence of that on this map here. It's a pretty interesting map. So this is what the MARTA system was supposed to look like. It was supposed to integrate 5 counties: Cobb County, Fulton County, DeKalb County, Gwinnett County, and Clayton County. And instead, Cobb County was out from day one, so that never happened. Gwinnett County and Clayton County eventually bailed, and it just kind of left it to be a 2-county transit system that now looks like this in 2020. Still not nearly as extensive as what the initial phase was supposed to look like back in the 1960s. The article from Atlanta Magazine brought out several reasons as to why this was. This is a case study that's useful to know when it comes to like the problems of public transportation systems in the United States, especially outside of the six major cities that we said generally works pretty well. You'll have to read the article for yourself if you haven't done so already, but the issue of race is kind of all over this. This was the MARTA system comes online right around the time of white flight in the late 1960s, early 1970s in the Atlanta area. So that kind of plays into the drama as to why the system never really stretches into the suburbs effectively. Something else that's interesting to note in this particular article, amongst other things, I'm just kind of flipping through it here real quick, is how even just the highway system itself in Atlanta, just Atlanta's just overall infrastructure was built to create congestion, which is kind of a crazy thing when you really think about it. But the article makes some good points as to why that was, and it mentions down towards the end that San Francisco and Washington D.C. their public transportation systems came online the exact same year as Atlanta's MARTA did, but those systems grew, those systems thrived, and Atlanta's system simply did not, for various civic reasons that you are going to have to read about if you haven't done so already. And it's a really, really interesting article. It's a really interesting case study. So I do encourage you to go into it. Now, compare our public transportation woes in the United States to a much more. One last thing before I do forget. The article was written in 2012, and so it was written right on the cusp of a major vote to expand MARTA throughout the Atlanta metro area, to expand MARTA into Gwinnett County, into Cobb County, into Clayton County. This map that you're looking at are the results of that vote. And if you look at that vote, you see the percentages of each precinct that voted yes to MARTA expansion. Only very, very few precincts in Cobb County down towards the south and near Cumberland Mall voted yes, fairly overwhelmingly. Otherwise, it's a pretty split vote in much of Cobb, and the further northwest in Cobb that you go, the less public transportation gets popular. If you look at Cherokee County, that was a solid no. Cherokee County right there to the north of Cobb, the only fully Burgundy County, or is that purple, on that particular map. So very, very interesting the way that this vote ended up going. We've had other votes since. They all kind of tend to go the same way. The millennial generation team seems to be more interested in public transportation than previous generations, so the votes are getting closer, but only Clayton County was the only county that MARTA ends up expanding into, and so now it's a 3-county system instead of a 2. Pretty close it's getting in Gwinnett County these days, these votes, and even in parts of Cobb, but we'll have to see what happens in the near future with this. Now, back to what I was going to say earlier. If you compare public transportation in the U.S. to other countries, you see some vast differences. In more developed Western European countries and in Japan, where car ownership rates are high, and although ownership rates are high, it's pretty expensive to operate them. You see extensive networks of buses, of trams, of subway lines that have been maintained, and funds for new construction have been provided in recent years as well. But anyway, it's an interesting discussion. It's one that needs to be had. I mean, if you're trying to understand like one of the major issues that American cities face, certainly the issue of infrastructure is a constant one. You don't really understand why infrastructure battles are ongoing unless you understand what we kind of talked about at the outset, that municipal government is a very complicated topic. And well, this leads to transportation complications as well. As we know and have seen. So that pretty much wraps things up for this day's class. What we're going to move into next, and I'm going to just kind of share this with you on my calendar. If you give me a second, so you see a lot of coronavirus tabs there. But let's see where we're at calendar wise here. Okay, fantastic. So, our next major topic is going to be dealing with issues shaping cities in the developing world. You will not have access to the Knox reading. It's a fairly long one anyway. I'm going to walk you through that reading on our screencast lecture tomorrow. So even though that reading is on the calendar, you can go ahead and ignore Knox pages 438 to 448. Just make sure you have notes on this discussion here. If you've got any questions, you can post them in the comments section on my blog. And that pretty much is going to do it for AP Human Geography for today. And we will see you online tomorrow. So until then, have a good day. Stay safe. Wash your hands. Practice social distancing, and look out for your neighbor in your community. All right, we'll see you guys soon.